Hello, and welcome to the May 2021 ENSO seminar. We are very lucky to be joined today by Alessandra Buccella, who is with the Wesleyan University in Connecticut, having come out of the University of Pittsburgh, is that right? And you've done some postdoc with Cincinnati. Yeah. So Alessandra has done work in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognitive science more broadly, and has looked at some work in active philosophy of perception. And today we'll be speaking about the nature of perception and perceptual science. So you're very welcome, and thanks for coming on. Thanks for giving us the time, Alessandra.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, sorry. Just as we allow viewers to come on stream and to sort of sync up with the live stream, we'll take our immediate commercial break. And so I'll invite you, if you have a paper that you've read recently or come across recently you think is worth flagging or bringing people's attention to, I invite you to sort of give it a mention.
Yeah. So as I was telling you earlier, having like teaching duties, especially during these times, didn't allow me to read a lot of, new things that have been coming out. But I did read a paper by my former teacher, Wayne Wu, who is at Carnegie Mellon University. The paper was published in 2020 in the Journal of Philosophy, and it's titled, "Is Vision for Action Unconscious?" So I'm pretty sure you can just Google that, and it will pop out. And it's an interesting paper because he sort of discusses some more recent evidence that came out regarding the two visual streams that probably many people here are already familiar with. And in particular, there seems to be new evidence about further sub-distinctions within the dorsal stream, which is apparently the visual stream that guides or is responsible for visually guided action. And many people tended to assume that it was unconscious, but it seems like now there is some evidence that disputes that. And he also makes another more general point, which is kind of similar to the point I'm making today, actually, which is when we draw broader ontological conclusions from empirical evidence, we should always be careful about how that empirical evidence was collected in the first place and what kind of assumptions were in the background, whether the methodology itself was appropriate to play the role of evidence for the conclusions that you want to make, because these things can come apart very easily. And if you lose track of them, it's even just for a second, you end up with strange commitments that actually don't help you. So yeah, it was also a good way to sort of link the commercial break to what I'm going to talk about soon.
Brilliant. So I think we have about a dozen people on live. We have a couple of people here live in the session as well. So hopefully there'll be a lively discussion once we come to the Q&A. So without further ado, I guess I can ask you to, I know you have some, just make sure that you're able to share screen. Okay.
Yes.
And I can invite you to present Perceptual Science and the Nature of Perception for the May 2021 ENSOs.
Thank you. I will be sharing my screen right now with my slides. Here we go. One second, okay. Now it should be good.
Yep.
All right. So basically the main point I want to make in this talk is that we should be more aware, or we should acknowledge, keep in mind the complications. There are many that are involved in connecting perceptual science to perceptual ontology, or to the contents of individual level perceptual experience. So I will bring these complications. My plan is to bring these complications to the surface, sort of diagnose them in two different forms. So I will first argue that while philosophers of perception who claim that perceptual science is a source of evidence or can support their theories about higher level, individual level perception, interpret such science with two assumptions in the background which themselves are not obviously endorsed by the science itself. And so this might create some asymmetry between what philosophers tend to think the science supports or proves or help them claim, and what the science is actually doing and the science is actually committed to or in the business of proving or demonstrating. On the other side, the second sort of dimension of these worries that I'm going to bring to the surface is that there is, on the other hand, another assumption that the science does seem to rely on pretty heavily, which is, however, something that philosophers of all kinds, like it's pretty universally accepted that that assumption in particular should not be incorporated in our theories of perceptual ontology. We should stay away from it. So there seems to be an asymmetry on both sides. On one hand, philosophers seem to have endorsed assumptions that the science doesn't endorse. On the other side, there seems to be an assumption that the science relies upon, from which philosophers should stay away from. So the first disclaimer that I should point out is that I'm restricting myself to a specific kind of perceptual science, a specific kind of philosophy. When I say science or philosophy, what I mean is, by perceptual science, I mean what I call the constructivist, computationalist tradition in perceptual science, and their sort of philosophical counterpart, which you can think of as this orthodox version of representationalism in philosophy of perception. One key example that comes to mind is Tyler Burge. Tyler Burge is exactly the paradigmatic philosopher that I have in mind here. He talks, for example, about in his 2010 Origins of Objectivity book, he talks about perceptual constancy, which, by the way, is the topic of my dissertation. So I've been reading about that for a while. Perceptual constancies as, in a way, the missing link between something that perceptual science in the constructivist computationalist framework studies and what we take our perceptual ontology to be composed by. And I'm gonna say more about that, but just so you know, what I'm talking about is mostly relates to the constructivist computational picture and orthodox representationalism and philosophy of perception. However, this is an ENSO seminar series. So for what does this have to do with enactive 4E approaches? Well, the point is that what I say here can very well apply to 4E approaches. So it's a general worry that whenever you have some scientific evidence and some theoretical commitments or theories, you need to be very careful about how those line up. So you can take, as inactivists should take this as a cautionary tale and a sort of a reminder to be careful about these kinds of issues. Okay, so let's start with these popular framework that I will actually discuss more at length. So what are these constructivism and computationalism in perceptual science? What does this science consist in? Well, here are my definitions. Constructivism, I take it to be this tradition in psychology, which comes from early 19th century, or figures like Helmholtz, and basically claims or has as their main guiding principle the claim that perceptual experience consists in combining simple sensory data according to quasi-inferential rules. Sometimes they're called inverse inferences, reverse inferences. Helmholtz called them unconscious inferences, although this notion of conscious, unconscious, I want to kind of stay away from that as a general rule, because that debate is messy. We sometimes don't even know what we mean by conscious or unconscious. But so the idea is that there are these simple sensory data, these simpler sensations that then have to be combined or recombined or by the brain in order to form an internal representation that then is used as a model of the world. And computationalism is basically sort of like, I take it to be in a way like an evolution, a more contemporary evolution of constructivism. So when cognitive science came along, computationalism sort of took over the constructivist framework in psychology and made it into something that could be used in cognitive science, and then mixed it up with the new work that was coming in cybernetics and computer science. And so computationalism takes cognitive processes to be processes that can be modeled by computer algorithms or mathematical functions of a particular kind, namely a kind that, again, is constructivist in nature, that start from simpler pieces, if you want, and then aims at building something, explaining how these simple pieces come to form a detailed description of the world. Think about David Marr. David Marr precisely even says literally that the goal of perception is to provide a true description of what is there. So that's the kind of framework that I have in mind. And work in this framework in psychology and cognitive science of perception also, if you want, has this like more general way of describing perception, something that you hear whenever you read the literature of philosophers of cognitive science working in this framework. Many times, like one thing that they say is that perception is just a matter of recovering the distal array of objects. So represent their external causes and their properties in terms of objects and properties, usually material objects, starting from noisy, ambiguous signals transmitted to the brain by sensory receptors. And this also has some, on an historical note, you may be familiar with Johannes Müller's doctrine of specific nerve energies. That is still now, there's been some work done by in particular, I know the work of Alistair Isaac in Edinburgh, who has recently argued that doctrine never really went away. Müller was one of Helmholtz's teachers. And that view of human physiology and the physiology of sensory systems is still pretty much endorsed by contemporary neurophysiology. And that simply says that each sensory receptor somehow forms its own, channel to the brain. There are specific nerves that connect to specific sensory receptors and connect to specific areas of the brain. So basically, there are all these different channels separately get to the brain, and then the task of the brain is to combine them and reconstruct what the original entire assembly looked like, almost like a Lego construction that gets shattered and then needs to be recomposed inside your head. So key notions here to get a grasp on this framework. The first one is underdetermination, and the other one related is the notion of inverse inference. So how does this picture work? Basically, like I said, you have a ton of small pieces, sensory pieces, which by themselves are do not carry enough information. Another thing that in the an active ecological tradition, another term that should be pretty familiar is the stimulus is impoverished, which famously Gibson rejected and argued against in many ways. But that's one of the key assumptions. There's underdetermination in stimuli because stimuli are atomistic. They're very little building blocks that by themselves in isolation don't carry enough information about their distal causes. So the stimuli underdetermine their distal causes. And then the notion of inverse inference comes in, because what do you do with these sensory pieces? How do you get to recombine them into a correct model of what is out there? Well, you do that allegedly, according to this picture, by using those little sense data, like sensory building blocks, and combine them with some rules of some kinds in an operation that does resemble a cognitive inference. You have some data, you take them as premises, and then you have some transition rules. Think about modus ponens that are in the brain. You know, people in the constructivist computationalist tradition disagree. Some people, Burge, for example, is very much not a realist about inferential rules in the brain, but for example, Marr was, allegedly. So, but the idea is that there are, it's in some way realized in the brain, some rules or biases that guide the reconstruction, given what comes in through the senses. And then this representation could be more or less accurate as a consequence of that. So inverse inference, in the sense that you need to reverse engineer whatever was out there in the world in order to have it as a mental model inside your head. Now, complication. Philosophers like Tyler Burge, like Michael Rescorla, when they talk about this kind of perceptual science and, you know, experiments in what you might, a good popular example is the studies on color constancy in the tradition that's called inverse optics. They work according to these principles of underdetermination and reverse inference and reconstruction of the distal array kind of idea. But philosophers, when they discuss perceptual science of this type and use it or claim that this science supports their theories in like orthodox representationalist theories, they do so with two assumptions in the background that are basically what constitutes the theoretical skeleton, if you want, of orthodox representationalism. I call these assumptions content and correspondence. So the definitions are a little bit of a mouthful, but you know, content, sensory systems are representational systems. Their outputs are states with content. Contents are intentional entities, so their aim is to accurately represent objects and properties that cause the sensory stimuli. Correspondence takes, you know, this is probably the core of orthodox representationalist views that rely on perceptual science of the constructivist computationalist kind, because it claims that there is some sort of relation of correspondence, which you can spell out in different ways, isomorphism, or even, you know, identity, or any other sort of correspondence-like relation between the contents of the states of sensory systems, which, according to content, are representations, and the contents of individual level perceptual states. So this framework just assumes the philosophical version, or the philosophical side of this framework at least, assumes that sensory systems themselves work by manipulating representations and are representational systems, and that the link with individual level perceptual states is just a link in terms of what the sensory systems give me. That is what's going to constitute the content of my individual level perceptual experiences. So as a consequence, there's some sort of structural similarity between the two. The same kind of entities that get represented by sensory systems are also the kind of entities that enter the contents of individual level perceptual experiences. And accuracy conditions get inherited as a consequence from the sensory states to the higher level perceptual states. That's why they can claim that looking at the science and what they say sensory states represent can give us insights into how to understand individual level perceptual states. Otherwise, this claim wouldn't be, grounded in anything. So that's what I take to be going on. There is something like the correspondence assumption going on here. Okay, so warning before I go into the issues with all this. I'm not claiming that orthodox representationalists think that the perceptual science proves or demonstrates or is evidence for content and correspondence. I think what's going on is more like there is a tendency to just implicitly take them as common ground. They take them to be among the theoretical background that is shared between orthodox representationalist philosophy of perception and computational constructivist psychology or cognitive science. Okay, what is the problem with this? Well, the problem is that it's not necessarily the case that constructivist computational perceptual science is committed or has content and correspondence in the background when they do their work. And in particular, it has been argued recently, but actually for quite a while by Frankie Egan, that especially in computational cognitive science, the notion of representation or the notion of content should not be taken as part of the theory proper, what she calls the theory proper. So computational theories of perceptual capacities, for example, they do not have intentional commitments or representational commitments built into them. What happens, according to Egan, is more that's what's more consistent, she says, with ordinary practice in computational cognitive science, that these contents are taken as intentional glosses. So they're somehow some add-on, some optional add-on that in specific contexts, depending on the kind of capacity that you are using that particular computational model to represent or to explain, can integrate the theory proper, so the mathematical structure that you're using, for pragmatic explanatory purposes. So more simply, it's just something that scientists do in order to make the theory more intelligible to themselves. You can say that a certain mathematical entity is a representation of, I don't know, the color of this particular surface, not because it is, in fact, a representation of that particular surface, but because talking about it as the representation of a particular surface give you insight into exactly how the mathematical computational structure lines up with the kind of psychological capacity that you are interested in. So on this account, then, content, the assumption that I named content, is not necessarily something that informs or lies in the background of computational cognitive science or constructivist cognitive perceptual science. Contents can be attributed or associated with a computational model, but they don't. The model itself and the science itself can't be done without any representational assumption on sensory systems. And of course, if content comes into, if the commitment to content is undermined, then also the commitment corresponds. There's no reason why they should also interpret or assume that science is committed to something like correspondence or cares about something like correspondence. Because if sensory systems are not intrinsically contentful in the first place, then there's no way to sort of justify the assumption that there is a correspondence between individual level representational contents and sensory states representational contents, because there's no representational contents in sensory states in the first place. Okay, that's why I'm saying if Egan is right, these are the consequences. I think Egan, well, I don't have time to go into her arguments specifically, but if you read her also most recent papers, I think she has pretty compelling points about how more traditional naturalizing content kind of theories like, you know, information theory, tracking theory, information theoretic, like Dretski's theory or telesemantic theories, they all have some sort of problem. And all the problems that she points at seem to have to do precisely with the fact that it is not obvious that we should treat sensory systems as intrinsically contentful. And she says, definitely that's not what cognitive scientists think, and that's not what cognitive scientists rely on while doing their work. So why should philosophers attribute these assumptions or commitments to cognitive scientists if cognitive scientists themselves don't really care about them? Which I think is fair, again, in terms of division of labor between philosophers and scientists. Okay, moving to the second concern. I wanted to suggest that computational constructivist perceptual science, on the other hand, does seem to endorse a different assumption, maybe implicitly. I call this the measuring instrument conception of sensory systems. And this, in turn, first, if I'm right that perceptual science, at least implicitly, relies on such an assumption, on the other hand, I'm going to also suggest that philosophers should not, even orthodox representationalists, and that's why there is a problem there. They should not rely on such an assumption. I'm just making sure that the time is, okay, I'm gonna speed up. Looks like I'm a little behind. Okay, so measuring instrument conception, think about it as just a hypothesis or a thesis according to which sensory systems are detection systems. They detect, they respond to specific features in the environment. And there's a way in which you can say they also measure the magnitude of these, the quantitative intensity of these features as in terms of the intensity of the electrical signal. So you might think there's a dedicated channel that processes color. And what does that mean? It means that there are certain sensors on the retina that respond to certain light frequencies and can respond to more or less intensely to different light frequencies. So in a way, you can sort of use that gathered data as proxy for it's measuring the intensity of the light reflected by specific surfaces. So conceiving of sensory systems in this way seems necessary for the notion of underdetermination and inverse inference to even be intelligible. So that's why I'm saying computational constructive perceptual science is at least implicitly endorsing this assumption, because the very architecture of their methodological, their methodological architecture based on underdetermination and inverse inference, and this like idea that there are scattered pieces that need to be recombined inside the brain, that is just what the measuring instrument conception of sensory systems allow you to do. That's how, because you consider sensory systems this way, then you can conceive of what they do in terms of resolving underdetermination and performing inverse inferences. I have to go quickly about this, but we can talk about it in the Q&A. But of course, sensory systems, we know from various sources that they're not really detection mechanisms. They're not measuring instruments. There's a lot of what enters our individual level perceptual states that is not simply the result of what single sensory organs or sensory receptors detect in the environment or respond to in the environment. There's much more of a creative role that sensory systems play in determining what we end up experiencing as subjects. Examples that I have myself worked on with my former advisor, Masvita Chirimura, is timbre, the perception of timbre. Timbre as a quality seems absolutely multidimensional and not even stably, it cannot even be stably modeled by a set cluster of simpler features. It depends, it's a global property of the soundscape, if you want. And whatever physical features of the environment matter for our experience of timbre varies from situation to situation. So there's no way to model that in terms of the auditory system being a measuring instrument. Same thing with gloss. The visual system is not a measuring instrument because we clearly experience properties like glossiness, but glossiness has been argued quite recently that it is also this kind of multidimensional global property that cannot be reduced to whatever sensory receptors in the visual system pick out and re-elaborate. There's much more that needs to be considered. I'm gonna skip this last remark and I'm gonna sum up saying that this is what I argued. Orthodox representationalists illegitimately interpret constructivist computational perceptual science through the lens of assumptions that the science itself doesn't endorse, namely, or does not necessarily endorse, namely content and correspondence. And then I said that constructivist computationalist perceptual science, on the other hand, does endorse a different assumptions, the measuring instrument conception, which, however, should be rejected by any philosopher interested in explaining individual level, the kind of entities that we experience, the objects of conscious level, individual level perceptual experience. So this is it. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry if I went a little bit over the allocated time. Please feel free to email me if you want clarification, if you want to read the whole paper, et cetera, et cetera. I'm happy to keep the discussion going.
That's great. So thank you very much, Alessandra. So we have a couple of people here. I have a couple of questions myself, and there's one been posted to the channel on YouTube there. I'll just, before I start giving voice to YouTube, as it were, I'll give Mike Beaton and Fred a chance to come in if they want to make a question. So just wave or flag. Fred, okay, go ahead there.
Thanks very much, Alessandra. That was great. And it's always really interesting to get the view from the other side as a 4E person to dive into some of the conundrums of representationalist approaches. And when I say from the 4E side, what I mean is that in the inactive world, typically people's questions, the questions they're asking are different. And so the answers are going to be different and the explanations are going to be different. It causes a lot of crosstalk. These conundrums, these difficulties are very, very real. You mentioned Egan's important point that the attribution of content is something scientists do to make the interpretation more easier. Does that not have the problem that you then, the only guiding light you have is your belief in your model? I'm not a Popperian. I'm not going to say, can you never falsify your model, but can you see anything other than your model? Doesn't that raise that problem?
It might. I'm not a representationalist myself, or at least I don't have enough background in computational cognitive science to know exactly how the procedure, how it goes the procedure goes. But yeah, you're right. It definitely takes out of the theory what supposedly makes the theory appropriate to model that capacity in the first place. So the idea, if I understood your point correctly, it seems that there is a mathematical structure, but the reason why you chose that mathematical structure instead of another to model that particular psychological capacity seems to rely on how you take that perception, that psychological capacity to work, or to be what you take that psychological capacity to do for the creature. Yeah. Which in turn can only be intelligibly described by using, intentional talk, or attributing the categories that we assume the creature is using to construct their own conscious experiential world.
That just seems terribly familiar territory. In an active perception, we always point out that any distinction you make, you're responsible for those distinctions. And we have this second order injunction before you come into the church. You have to bow and say, yes, I will remember that I am the observer and I created it in the first place. So it's interesting to see these.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying 4E people should take this as a cautionary tale, to just remember that it's always a risk to put too much into to overload the bridge between philosophy and science, which then ends up making the bridge just collapse altogether.
I have another comment.
Thank you for the question.
Let Mike go ahead there first.
Mike, go ahead there, yeah.
Okay, hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I had sort of brief comments on your main point 1 and point 2. Maybe I'll just mention them briefly. So, I mean, on point 1, I feel like I probably would agree with Egan that the scientists think that's all they're doing, is giving a gloss, but I think that maybe they're sort of more committed than they realise to the content representationist type view, because they would overlook the types of explanations, like these sort of embodied robotics people like Imran Harvey and Randall Beer. They sort of show the possibility of these really embodied minimal agents that do things really apparently without any representations inside them. It's just the nature of the coupling to the world. And I think standard cognitive science overlooks the very possibility of that kind of explanation, because it is actually quite wedded to something that philosophers express more clearly than the scientists do. Yeah. That's on point 1.
Yeah, that might be right. Also talking this, we do this a lot as philosophers. We generalize. We talk about philosophers and we talk about scientists. Many times it varies even in the science from lab to lab or from individual to individual. If some of them might be more philosophically savvy and they might be more aware and might be even willing to endorse certain assumptions, others don't even take themselves to be doing anything even remotely related, and they don't see like ways of talking as automatically or getting dangerously close to ways of committing yourself to a certain ontology.
I mean, I suppose it relates to I actually hadn't kind of tried to formulate this as a question or a comment, but from what you've just said to me, I mean, my overall feeling from reading your abstract was, it's very interesting, but I wasn't quite sure whether I was agreeing with you or disagreeing with you. I mean, I was not really sure whether you're saying there should be like no friction, maybe to use some Mochdalian phrase, between philosophy and cognitive science or science perception, or whether there should be, because I feel like the lesson, or the appropriate lesson that 4E philosophy of cognitive science should take away is actually that it should be a dialogue between the philosophy and the science, and that if the science has gone wrong philosophically, the philosophy can inform it. But I don't just mean, think about it differently. I mean, actually do different experiments, realize that you're overlooking physical scientific explanations that you didn't think were possible, but they are, because you were thinking about the whole thing. I don't know if you agree with that at all.
That seems, that's exactly, I totally agree. One way to take my diagnosis further would be, okay, then let's just sit down and rethink about even the very questions that we're asking, or the very thing that we take to be a model of a psychological capacity. Like, does it even make sense to think of a psychological capacity in isolation, or to model it in isolation from the environment, or as just taking brain functioning as the basis of a psychological capacity, when we know that brain functioning and the patterns of brain activity vary even within the same task, depending on there's no two identical patterns of brain activity whenever you perform a certain task or have a certain perceptual stimulus in front of you. So all of this is just, yeah, what I said is just the beginning of a much broader discussion.
Okay, sounds good. Shall I let someone else have a go, Marek? I'm sure I could carry on.
Yeah, no, I'll just give voice to, well, I'll attempt to give voice to just something that there's a little bit of discussion going on YouTube at the moment regarding I guess there's two quick points we might make. One, from Peter Cariani, who I probably won't be able to articulate terribly effectively, and my apologies for that. And that is just that the characterization of sensory systems as measurement systems is the problems that you identify, which I don't think there's any disagreement with, is that they don't. There is another way. There are other ways of characterizing sensory systems, which might still be considered measurement, but aren't measurement of the same kind. And I think in particular there's that kind of, that you just have a sensory mosaic which maintains some kind of correspondence with aspects of the world is not the way forward.
Yeah.
I think just the way sensory systems seem to work, and I think there's some suggestion, perhaps there was no explicit reference to task-specific systems, but I get the impression that now, unfortunately, my connection is starting to mess up the video here, so it's actually difficult to read some of the text. But the kind of Gibsonian approach, which doesn't rely on that kind of straightforward sort of pixel-like isomorphism between sensory surface and perceived object, doesn't fall foul of those concerns. Yeah. Would you agree?
I do. Yeah. In general, I do. Also, however, you say task specific. I would like to know how that works, or how that's modeled functionally speaking, because it can still be that the task specific representation, maybe it's a higher level of, there's a higher level neural network that represents the task, but the input that they get is still from these pixel-like sensory detection from the world. But again, I don't really know enough of neuroanatomy to go into the weeds of the details. I would agree that definitely what I'm saying is, to an extent, an oversimplification, and that many computational cognitive scientists don't think of sensory systems this way. But what I wanted to point out was precisely, that's good, but be careful, because what you say might be interpreted in this way, and if it's interpreted in this way, then you have problems, or your fellow philosophers that come to you for help have problems. Also, there's a whole debate around measurement that I've been only superficially diving into right now, but some people, actually a referee where I've submitted this material before, pointed out to me that the literature on measurement is so vast, and my idea of like measurement as detection of magnitudes, that is probably also kind of an oversimplification, and there are different ways of conceiving of measurement. So that also should be taken as with a grain of salt. The fact that I call it measuring instrument, maybe I should just say detection instruments or something like that.
Yeah,
I thank you for the question. I'm aware that there's a lot more to be worked out there.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah, I think that does seem to be getting at least some of the discussion on YouTube here, that there's an awful lot riding on the question of what's being measured and what kinds of measurement we're talking about. Something that's, I guess, slightly more specific, and then we might come back to Mike if he has a further follow-up, is Andrew Wilson has raised the question of interface theory. And in particular, I think he's curious as to whether you're diagnostic of what's different about interface theory, or what's interface theory's move. So would it be accurate, or would it be fair to characterize interface theory as giving up on the correspondence assumption, on essentially sort of putting that to one side? Is that what is new, or an attempt to be different within interface theory, or is...
Yes. Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
Yeah, interface theory is an interesting case, because on the one hand, they still seem to sort of use a lot of computational constructivists, or to rely on many parts of this framework. But then, yeah, it seems, yeah, no, that seems right. Yeah, they are definitely trying to get rid of correspondence, which makes me think, but then do they get rid of content? And that's where the problems start, in the sense that they don't seem to sort of, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the back and forth that there has been between Hoffman and colleagues in the interface theory, and people like Jonathan Cohen, who's a hardcore philosopher of perception. And he was pointing out that what the interface theorists called content doesn't really line up with the philosophical notion of content, which is more of this like robust representation intentional relation that requires a certain conception of what the perceiver and the subject is. So there's some mismatch there as well. Yeah.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. So Mike, do you want to come back in there, and I'll continue to the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, again, I've maybe a couple of things that I was keen to say, but I mean, one was, okay, so getting to your point too, one of your types of argument was that there are some very rich qualities like timbre or glossiness that we can't really capture, that we couldn't really reduce to just some combination of individual sensations. But I mean, I guess because I in the past have tried to write some stuff around this same idea too, and I've tried to engage with people who are computationalists and try to convince them of a more holistic view. The point is, you obviously, once you're convinced by things like that, then you're convinced. But to convince someone who isn't, you need to find a way to say, well, why couldn't you pick out timbre with a rich enough? I mean, for instance, to be perfectly honest, I would imagine if you took Google's DeepMind and trained it on sound samples, you could make it pick out timbre, like almost better than a human. Probably it would probably pick up a trumpet with some background noise that a human couldn't hear or something. So I mean, so I actually am sympathetic to your view, but I think it's very hard to convince people who aren't why they're wrong. So maybe let you come back on that. Yeah,
I mean, true. It depends how complex these, structures end up being.
That's fine though. For a computationist, they would probably acknowledge that something very rich like timbre, you can convince them it's rich with your phenomenological investigations. They can say, okay, it's rich, it will need a rich structure.
Yeah, the complication that I see is that it doesn't seem to be just one single set of variables. So the model, you can train an AI to detect timbre, but the problem is that the same algorithm would not work in different environments. For example, if the material obstacles that are in between the hearer and the source change. This is, again, I don't know the exact experiments that have been done, but I know that people claim that. There's a paper by, again, Alistair Isaac, 2018, that talks about timbre physicalism and what the prospects are. And he goes more for something like a non-reductive physicalism of the Gibsonian kind. But even that, I don't know, maybe I'm just too much of a holist. But also speaking recently with a musician person and someone who's studying this kind of stuff, they seem to agree, and it seems to be something that, for example, when you try to synthesize instruments in electronic music composition, they take that to be sort of a given, that timbre is not reducible to a specific function that works every time. The same sound could be picked out and modeled in different ways depending on where the sound happens and all the special relationships in the whole soundscape and in the whole physical environment.
Yeah,
that's and the same for gloss. That goes exactly the same for gloss.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic, and as I say, I genuinely am. I think you're right, in fact. But I've also found sometimes when you try to explain controversial, as I would think of them, controversial inactivist positions to sort of artists or dancers, they say, well, yeah, of course, perception's like that, right? But the cognitive scientists think, of course, it isn't like that. But an interesting thing, because traditional computationist cognitive science is still the dominant scientific theory of perception and mind, really, the scientific one, is how do you begin to convince those people? I think it's an interesting question, because they and I think that which was me once a long time ago, but they now would say things like, well, you just taking on board more data, right? You're saying, well, it depends on this and this. So, okay, maybe we have to have layers of perceptrons or layers of mind machine, and we just need to take on board more data. And you need to, personally, I think that going from the route of showing that there's some really low level, simple things that can be done without any representations at all is kind of a better lever to get in than just saying, well, it's very complex. They say, well, fine, then it needs a very complex representation. Do you see where I'm coming from? It's just
no, absolutely.
How can I change those people's mind?
Yeah. I don't want to say I've given up on that already, but you know, it's not my priority. We'll see once I will. My intention is to keep working more and more with scientists moving on, precisely to sort of get a better understanding of where they come from and what they actually think. That's the problem, that I don't think I have enough data determining who my opponent actually is, or my opponent, or so. But yeah, you're definitely right, and I've been discussing this even with my students in my philosophy of psychology class. I had psychology majors, neuroscience majors, and they always went back to that. But it's just, you just get more complex data. You just get deep learning algorithms and neural networks that learn stuff, and then you can model everything.
It was, if it's okay, Marek, was Fred wanting to come in with a point on this?
I'll just, sorry, Fred, I'll because it's directly relevant, I'll very quickly mangle a point from YouTube here, and then Fred, I'll let you come back in. It's just that there seems to be some, so Peter Cariani, who's an auditory neuroscientist, sort of points out that there are a lot of aspects of timbre that are actually very well understood, that you're going to capture with maybe 5 or 10 dimensions, but that nevertheless, it's a sort of a number of aspects of it, and in particular, perhaps just the issue of embodiment will mean that machine learning is still not going to do it.
The very anatomy of the human hearing system is just it plays a role for sure, and we know that For example, the hair cells in the cochlea don't really work as Fourier analyzers, although people can model them that way because there is a value in, you know, abstracting and idealizing for the purposes of modeling and empirical tractability. But again, there might be a discussion of how much abstraction and idealization still allows you to capture the very phenomenon, rather than too much abstraction and idealization that it just changes the phenomenon. It just changes the fact of the matter of what we're trying to explain and what we're trying to capture, to model. So,
Fred, please.
So I want to carry on this. I'm not leaving the topic, but I have to step in and express my distaste for machine learning, I suppose. When we say that add more layers, add more data, and we can model it, all we can model is our linguistic habits of talking about it. So timbre is something for which we have poorly developed everyday terms, whereas colors, we've learned to name them all. Newton told us what the names of the colors are, and we learned how to use them. But timbre is a bit more like the taste of a complex wine, in that you could develop a specialized vocabulary for it, but it'd be a long time before that got standardized. There's also confusion there, because we could speak of the timbre of a cello, but we could also speak of the timbre of the cello played in this location at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the presence of 3 people. Yeah. And sound doesn't tell you which one you mean. And so it's inherently mistaken to think if we standardized the location, and we standardized the time, and we standardized the listening conditions, and we developed a specialized vocabulary, then we could end up with terms that were sufficiently precise that we could say, yes, machine learning has done it, and machine learning could do it. There's an exact parallel here from phonetics. So in phonetics, a lot of the time, we're dealing with a complex speech sound, which is all kinds of things, and phonologists tends to deal with abstractions, which are phonemes, which are abstracted from that. And they have very clear ideas about what right and wrong answers are, because they correspond or not with spelling. And so one of these categorical distinctions that allows you to say something is right or wrong comes from studying of what's called a voicing contrast, the difference between ba and pa. Mm-hmm. Now, it turns out that you can develop a constructivist paradigm which will allow you to categorize correctly sounds as ba or pa by varying a single cue, which is the voice onset time. And we can do that physically, and we can build an entire conceptual apparatus around this. Right. If we neglect all the other aspects of the stimulus, because when we go back to the sound and we find it, I'm on your side, it's entirely holistically rich, there's at least 18 more cues there that co-vary with this one distinction. And the fact that we can build robust methods to reinforce our conviction that we have the right answer is utterly misleading in that case. So timbre and gloss could be standardized, but why would you bother? I mean, they're indicative of a much larger problem.
Yeah, I think Paul Churchland talks about phonemes when he has a paper at some point that discussed phonemes as an example of how a scientific theory doesn't really match up with whatever philosophical role we want to assign to certain entities, like phonemes in other contexts. I've read that paper a long time ago, but yeah, I was familiar with the issue with phonemes, and yeah, I mean, I agree completely with you. It's a really interesting case.
You were saying there's a cautionary tale. I think there is a cautionary tale in here for all of us. And if your methods are too solid and they convince you that you can tell the difference between a right answer and a wrong answer, a neural network can now do it. But that's not because it's magic. It's because you reduce the question to something trivial. Yeah.
And even, there's also the broader question of how much can a single, experimental framework or a single methodology grasp about reality, and whether each single model is in itself capable of capturing at least a certain interpretation of the world, or whether models are necessarily meant to be just perspectives, if you want, so that, you know, you have a computationalist picture or model of a certain capacity, and then you have a embodied and active model of the same capacity. And these are not necessarily rival theories that describe the same capacity differently, but you might think of them as more of complementary and highlighting different aspects. Both of them capture something right, but neither of them capture everything. So that's more of a, you know, conciliatory observation, which is something that I'm totally sympathetic with. I think there's a reason why constructivist computational cognitive science is still around and it's still so popular. So we should, as 4E sympathetic people, should take that seriously and not just, you know, drag our feet and think, no, they're just wrong about everything. They should just, you know, we should wipe out their whole brain and rewire it so that they can finally get things right. I'm exaggerating, of course, but I often hear this, like, getting nervous around each other and sort of seeing each other as rivals, when maybe there's not much.
You know, wiping the brain only works for their side. They want to do that to us.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like, is it even something that you can fight for? Is it even a battle that you can win? The idea is maybe it's not even a battle, let alone someone winning it.
Well, on that very positive and conciliatory point, I think that we're coming to the end of our time. There are a number of other questions that are still that have sort of dropped into the YouTube chat there, but they would take us in some entirely new directions. I think very interesting, fascinating directions, particularly with the extent to which the logic that you apply can be or might have an impact or implications for our understanding of the relationship between ecological psychology and realism, for instance.
Absolutely.
But the time being what it is, I think we'll have to sort of close this up, as it were. But I do invite everyone, as ever, to use the ENSO Seminars webpage and the discussion there as an opportunity to continue.
Or my email, just yeah, because this is a work in progress. I am absolutely looking forward to discussing this more with anybody who would like to. So just look me up.
Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you very much, Alessandra. Again, sort of applause and there's applause and thanks from the group on YouTube as well. We'll say thank you very much, and we will see everyone hopefully in about a month's time, when we will look forward to what I think will be the finish of the present academic series of ENSO Seminars before we take our summer break. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandra.
Thank you.